Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to address today's annual conference for science and the environment. The Israel Society of Ecology and Environmental Sciences is one of the oldest and most reputable environmental organizations in Israel. So it's a pleasure to be joining you on the Society's 50th anniversary to give you today's keynote address. I want to begin by commending your work to advance environmental science and to increase public understanding of the challenges that we face through science education, communication, and engagement. Science is what enables us to understand how and why our climate is changing and the risks posed, and of course, the solutions that are available to deal with this. The scientific evidence is absolutely clear. The United Nations body on climate change, the IPCC, has released two major reports this year, each agreed by almost 200 countries and synthesizing thousands of research papers. The reports conclude unequivocally that we must urgently adapt and reduce emissions, that the window of time we have left to act is closing, and that it's closing fast. Because the reports make clear that climate change is already wreaking havoc. Ecosystems are being irreversibly destroyed, ice caps are melting at rapid pace, causing sea levels to rise, people are being forced from their homes, and water insecurity has increased. Climate change isn't something that affects other people. Climate change doesn't recognize borders, and ultimately it is a threat to every nation and every sector on Earth. In fact, half of humanity is already highly vulnerable to climate change, and unless we act collectively, the IPCC is clear that within our lifetimes, the impacts will grow in force and ferocity to terrifying levels. And it's not only the science that tells us that our situation is critical. When I visited Indonesia recently, I saw homes being relocated to save people from rising seas. In Bolivia, indigenous leaders told me last year how longer and harder rains are causing flooding in their lands. And this year, India and Pakistan have experienced unbearable temperatures. 1 billion people exposed to extreme heat in some of the hottest months since records began. And in South Africa, which I visited last month, floods have swept the province of KwaZulu-Natal, destroying buildings and claiming lives. At the same time, Vladimir Putin's illegal, brutal, and unprovoked war against Ukraine has emphasized that climate and environmental security are totally interlinked with energy and national security. But we have a choice here. The IPCC reports, whilst unequivocal that our situation is critical, do make clear that the future is not yet written. Some of the impacts of climate change are already unavoidable and irreversible. But limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels would protect us from the worst impacts of climate change if we choose to act immediately. And the science shows that it is still possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We know how to build a more climate-resilient society. We know how to protect people, economies, and ecosystems. And thanks to the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and the historic Glasgow Climate Pact, which under the UK stewardship was forged between almost 200 countries at COP26, we have the framework for doing so. But unless we turn the commitments we have made into action, and unless we do so much faster to close the gap between need and action, this framework will remain words on a page. It is imperative that we deliver the Glasgow Climate Pact. As I say, the pact is a historic agreement because based on the commitments made in that pact and through commitments made outside the negotiating rooms as well, we were able to say with credibility that we kept alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And as a result of the work done in the lead up to COP, 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero targets. The Glasgow Climate Pact calls on countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets as necessary to align with the Paris temperature goal by the end of this year. It urges developed countries to scale up climate finance and specifically to double finance for adaptation by 2025. And it underlines the importance of adaptation, the dangers of loss and damage, and the need to scale up action and support for both, whilst charting a way forward to do so. We also heard significant commitments from countries, from companies, and financial institutions, and they pledged to clean up vital sectors like power and transport, to end deforestation, and to work together to accelerate the clean transition. Altogether, if the commitments made around COP26 are honoured on time, we can limit the rise in global temperature to below 2 degrees. That was a conclusion of the International Energy Agency at the time, and this analysis has been backed up by a more recent study in the respected scientific journal, Nature. Now, we must see those commitments implemented. I'm pleased that we've seen some progress since COP26 on the commitments made in Glasgow. We've had 13 new nationally determined contributions. At the May ministerial meeting that I co-chaired in Copenhagen, we brought together almost 50 governments, and I was encouraged by some of the statements made about countries looking actively at their NDC. 7 countries set out plans to revisit their emissions reduction targets at the recent Major Economies Forum chaired by President Biden, which I was pleased to join. 51 long-term strategies have now been submitted to the UNFCCC, including 5 since Glasgow. And more than 2.5 billion people are now covered by adaptation plans. And of course, work is being done to scale up finance and through the Access to Finance Task Force, co-chaired by the UK and Fiji, to make sure it can reach the climate vulnerable countries that need it most. We also saw progress on key work programs at the intersessional meetings in Bonn last month. So the scorecard on the Glasgow Climate Pact reads, some progress made, but a lot more to do. And we need to quicken the pace. Every country must respond to the call to revisit and strengthen their NDC, particularly the G20, which are responsible for over 80% of global emissions. They must do so not at some vague point in the future, but by September the 23rd this year, which is the deadline set by the UNFCCC. And more countries must submit long-term strategies by that deadline too. Because these NDCs must be backed by credible policies that deliver on the commitments made in Glasgow. From commitments on coal and cars to trees and methane to an acceleration of the shift to renewables, as well as the move to clean technologies, which are at the heart of the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda. We also need developed nations and other climate finance providers to ensure finance flows to national and local adaptation priorities, supporting developing countries' ambitions. And that means further progress on delivering the $100 billion and on the commitment to double adaptation finance to $40 billion by 2025. We must also get the Santiago network operationalized by COP27 to show progress on the work on the global goal on adaptation and the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage. Now, all of this may sound like a large program of work, but frankly, it's what we agreed to deliver in Glasgow. And in some respects, this is just the start. Looking ahead to COP27 and indeed beyond, we need to see faster progress on mobilizing the trillions of dollars needed to put the world on a more sustainable footing. Finance for developing countries, not least through our just energy transition partnerships, such as the one we agreed for South Africa at COP26. Finance for critical sectors and finance for clean technologies. The breakthrough agenda that I mentioned earlier was launched at COP26 and spans key sectors. From power to hydrogen and steel, it forms an important commitment to working together internationally to accelerate the development and deployment of the clean technologies that we need. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Israeli government for endorsing the steel, road transport, hydrogen, and power breakthroughs. And I would encourage the government to join others in endorsing the agricultural breakthrough as well. We know the benefits of this particular program of work are wide-reaching. If we meet the breakthrough goals we set ourselves in Glasgow, our work could create 20 million jobs and add $16 trillion to the global economy across 5 sectors that account for more than 50% of global emissions. So for all of us, It's now time to set out clear plans for how these breakthroughs will be delivered. Indeed, across all of the issues that I've spoken about today, it is clearly in our collective self-interest to act, and to act now. And just as international collaboration is central to the work of your society and of this conference, it'll be central to the work ahead of us on the road to COP27. I will be using the remaining months of the UK's COP26 presidency to urge further action through the G7, the G20 at the UN General Assembly, and during the second Climate and Development Ministerial in September, which the UK will host in the margins of the UN General Assembly. Because whilst the work we did in Glasgow did allow us to say with credibility that we'd kept 1.5 degrees alive, the pulse of 1.5 remains weak. The only way to strengthen it is to redouble our efforts and to implement the commitments that we have made. Thank you, and best of luck for the rest of the conference.